नमस्कार। हर संडे की तरह आपके साथ जुड़ चुका हूँ। कुछ ना कुछ देने की कोशिश करता हूँ। पिछले 5-6 संडे हम लोग रिस्क मैनेजमेंट के अलावा कुछ टॉपिक्स पे बात कर रहे थे जो लेटेस्ट थे और जिससे इम्पैक्ट अर्बन कोऑपरेटिव बैंक्स पे बहुत आ रहा था। टुडे आई इंटेंड टू स्टार्ट द रेजिडुअल सीरीज ऑन द रिस्क मैनेजमेंट ऑफ अर्बन कोऑपरेटिव बैंक्स and we'll catch up with the residual topics of risk management, which are in the range of 8 to 9 topics which we will be discussing. To start with, I'll be touching upon the credit risk areas and what is extremely important for the urban cooperative bank to look into. As I have already informed you that at the end of the series, I'll be helping you out in drawing a risk management policy for the urban cooperative bank, because that's going to help you in drawing a proper risk policy. That is the whole idea of this entire series. When I talk of credit risk, it's only not only identification, but we'll be making passing references to the mitigation that we would be resorting in this particular video. I personally believe that this is one of the biggest risk in the urban cooperative bank. Of course, there are many other risks, but this is the key risk which percolates to the smallest possible urban cooperative bank in the country, and therefore it's extremely important that we understand the concept and the mitigation measures which are normally required to be taken, where you have to be careful. For almost over 100 years you have been doing credit business. You are also resorting to localized risk practices. You know your borrower very well, but then what is happening is that after understanding the concept, it is required to be documented as to what will be the credit risk policy for the bank. Not many banks are drawing the credit risk policy, but it's extremely essential because things are changing and the regulation is changing, and therefore if you find that the inspection report of the Reserve Bank of India of late is written in such a way that they try to evaluate the risk that is faced by the bank, in the sense that internal risk assessment is done by the inspecting officers, and they try to identify the areas where the urban cooperative bank is exposed as far as the risk is concerned. Forget about the credit risk. They also try to talk of various risk areas where you have to be very careful. So what I'm going to talk is couple of clipettes, couple of points on the basis of which what is the risk involved and what are the mitigation measures. Let me tell you, if you read any of the circular of Reserve Bank of India in respect of the credit risks that we normally talk about, Reserve Bank of India itself has provided several risk measures. If they are implemented properly, you are in a position to handle the risk management extremely well. So the first point which I would like to talk about is the requirement of capital that you must have. Tier 1 and Tier 2. The norm currently that is in existence is you must have a CRAR of 9 to 12. Although in the revised guidelines, Reserve Bank of India is saying that by March 26, you should be having 12% CRAR is what they are expecting. So your business, credit business especially, which calls for various risk weightages, you should have a credit risk weight of around 12% by the end of March 26. That should be your focus, because if you lose that focus, it's quite possible that you may end up having a default in the CRAR that is required to be maintained. Secondly, what is extremely important is that I'm sorry, I'm having some difficulties. What is important is that the exposure norm which has been given by Reserve Bank of India has to be evaluated, calculated correctly by you. You know that for the individual exposure, 15% norm is there. For a group, it is 25%. Again, within these norms, it's extremely important that you must have your own space or margin. अगर 15% इंडिविजुअल एक्सपोजर नॉर्म पे आपका एक्सपोजर 10 करोड़ का आता है, तो यू हैव टू इंश्योर दैट you bring it down from the 10 crores to say 7 crores or 8 crores. Because why that margin is required? This is one of the way of managing risk. Why that margin is required? That margin is required to ensure that if at all accidental spillover is there in terms of lending, you are not violating the Reserve Bank of India norms. Same is the story for the group loans, is what I believe that is required to be managed in a proper fashion. Uh, Secondly, and the most important area which I feel is that Reserve Bank of India almost always issues the restrictions, mitigation guidelines and restrictions imposed by Reserve Bank of India. They are issued via two circulars. One is statutory restrictions and the second is management of advances, where they advise you what you should not be doing. For example, one of the common restriction which you all know is this: no directors loans except fixed deposit and LIC. Now directors loans and their relatives loans should be completely banned. You should not entertain, and then you need to have a proper database. If you have all the relatives accounts of your directors properly tracked and controlled, there is no chance of even accidental lending to your director or his or her relatives. This restriction is viewed very acidically by Reserve Bank of India with this, for the simple reason, other than fixed deposit, Reserve Bank of India expects that you should not be entertaining any loan to any of the directors except the fixed deposit. That's what I have been saying. There is an old concept in banking industry. You know that the commercial banks have been doing it. You are not supposed to do that. And what is that? Bridge loans. You're not supposed to entertain bridge loan. You're not supposed to entertain interim finance even for your customers, because that's where you do not have mechanism of controlling it. Reserve Bank of India's management of advances circular categorically states no bridge loans. If you grant a bridge loan, that is interim funding, that is not expected from a urban cooperative bank. Similarly, no loans to the commodities, no loans against shares, debentures, units of mutual fund. These are barred. Of course, from 2003, these loans are barred. Why these were barred? Because of the Madhavpura episode. You might be knowing that lending against the equity was barred. So much so that you cannot even take the equities or debentures as collaterals. There was one instance where under one bank took collateral security of shares and it was penalized by Reserve Bank of India, because you are not supposed to do that. So these are the risk elements in respect of the lending that you normally undertake. Other paper securities, you can definitely go and do that. Loans against various paper securities are also permitted. The only condition that which I find is that these paper securities are required to be charged properly. If they are not charged properly, you create an inbuilt risk in lending. Because without creating charge, if you grant loan, say against industry, there are cases where bogus industries have been placed with the urban cooperative banks, and therefore you have to be very careful. There is one more area which Reserve Bank of India has been harping and recently extremely so much, that is unsecured loan. There is a restriction of 10% of your total advances on unsecured loans. Unsecured loans are the loans where there is no security, there is no fallback action. NPA agar account ban jata hai, to you have to make a complete provision because there is no security. Overall control is there, but then in the entire banking industry, what is happening is that the unsecured loans, there is already a restriction. You will find that these unsecured loans which the urban cooperative banks are granting, in terms of compliance with the concentration risk, a lot of banks had embarked upon granting unsecured loans to the employees of reputed companies, thereby tinkering with the percentage of unsecured loans within the balance sheet. So that balancing act is required to be maintained in a proper fashion. If it is not maintained properly, you have difficulties. You have difficulties. Priority sector lending, I did not talk because you have been granted a relief this time, but then priority sector lending is also one of the areas where you have to be very careful and comply with what is the requirement. There is one more area where the urban cooperative banks are not really willing, not really gung-ho, not really very aggressive, and that area, there are two areas in fact. One is the consortium lending and the other is multiple lending. there is a difference between these two, consortium lending and multiple lending. In respect of consortium lending, what happens? There's a common security, 2 or 3 or 4 banks come together, they charge the security commonly, they have a common documentation. What is the risk involved? There is a leader. In a consortium lending, there is always a leader, and leader is supposed to protect the interests of all other member banks. Member banks are not in a position to control the financial activities of the borrower, and that's where the problem comes up, wherein the leader fails to protect the interests of the member banks, and that creates different kind of difficulties. And let me tell you, exiting from the consortium lending is extremely difficult. I have seen many banks who say that हमारा पैसा दे दो, हम लोग कंसोर्शियम से बाहर निकल जाते हैं. ऐसा होता नहीं है. Substitution is possible. You cannot exit the consortium lending directly like this. It's extremely important that consortium lending, you have to understand the documentation, that is common hypothecation or mortgage deed, common loan agreements, all these you have to understand properly. Your own interests, your own bank's interests are required to be plugged properly. So consortium lending, do entertain, but then have a complete understanding, because in case of consortium, when the account goes bad, the banker needs to have a proper understanding as to how the recovery under consortium is required to be undertaken. That's the risky area. It doesn't come up immediately. That happens at a later date. And in fact, in respect of multiple lending, there is already a banker who has lent to the borrower. You obtain NOC from the principal banker, and then you grant facility on a separate security on a separate terms. Reserve Bank of India insists that in respect of consortium, there has to be a quarterly meeting, there has to be exchange of information. Same is the story with multiple lending. In respect of multiple, the risk is more because you are an outsider. In respect of consortium lending, risk is little less because you are an insider. But then multiple lending is required to be done in respect of reputed borrowers. Reserve Bank of India has not defined reputed, but then you should be sure of the borrower who is reputed or not. So these are the two areas where the risks are different, and your understanding of the type of lending in both these areas has to be very critical. There is one more area in terms of aggressive lending many banks adopt, is this takeover. Take over the loan from some other bank. Let me tell you, there was a story a few years ago that these urban cooperative banks used to have kind of मिली-जुली. यानी कैसा वो था? It was like मेरा NPA अकाउंट आप ले लो, आपका NPA अकाउंट मैं ले लूंगा. रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया केम टू नो क्विकली. आजकल रिजर्व बैंक जब आती है तो वो सबसे पहले आसान चीज करती है. वो क्या करती है? Give us the list of takeover accounts, and the only thing they try to check is that at the time of takeover, what was the status of that account in the books of that particular bank, whether it was standard or otherwise. You have to prove it. And if it is not standard, if it is a borderline also, Reserve Bank of India is raising serious objection. So you must have a policy of takeover of loans. क्योंकि नॉर्मली टेक ओवर क्यों होता है? बोरो तुमको क्या कहता है कि मुझे एडिशनल फैसिलिटी चाहिए, ये बैंक नहीं दे रहा है. इसका मतलब ही ये है that bank is not willing to grant this particular person additional money and that you are trying to give. So 100 सवाल यहीं पे खड़े होते हैं. So in case of takeover, if it is aggressively done by you without the request of borrower, you stand an advantage. If it is at the request of borrower, दाल में कुछ काला है. You have to be very careful is what I believe. Now these are only clippets in this part 1 of the credit risk management. There are several other areas I would like to cover and touch base upon. That I will do next Sunday. आपको जो भी सवाल है, आपको कोई भी डिफिकल्टी है, पूछिए. मेरा ईमेल आईडी रहता है, आप ईमेल में पूछ सकते हैं. आप यूट्यूब पे भी कमेंट कर सकते हैं. थैंक यू सो मच फॉर वॉचिंग दिस वीडियो. थैंक यू सो मच.